So how can fiscal policy actually impact the macroeconomy? How can we use fiscal policy to combat both recessionary and inflationary gaps? Well, this actually happens by actually impacting the aggregate demand. So the application of fiscal policy has a direct effect on the U.S. aggregate demand. Essentially what we're going to be doing is employing fiscal policy to impact the U.S. aggregate demand to either combat an inflationary or a recessionary gap, just like we do with the monetary economy. So essentially what this aggregate demand does by affecting the aggregate demand, it's affecting the equilibrium level of GDP, and it's affecting the interest rates of the economy. Now, the way that fiscal policy actually differs from monetary policy is that monetary policy actually has a targeted rate of interest. Whereas monetary policy is looking at a specific rate of interest. They're trying to target that rate of interest to either spur on or contract the economy. The fiscal policy doesn't really look at that. They just realize, hey, we're in a recessionary or an inflationary gap, and we're going to employ fiscal policy to try and counteract and get us back to full employment, whichever way it might work. So this fiscal policy can be applied, like we were saying, on both either a contractionary or an expansionary context. We can use the expansionary fiscal policy or a contractionary fiscal policy. So let's dive into how an expansionary fiscal policy would work. Well, expansionary fiscal policy is pretty simple. We're going to be either increasing government spending or cutting taxes, or a combination of both. So what are we trying to do with the expansionary fiscal policy? With the expansionary fiscal policy, we're trying to spur on the economy. We're trying to get the economy going again. We're trying to get more people to work. So how can we do that? By increasing government spending. Well, if you remember all the way back to chapter 12, whenever we're finding that equilibrium of the product market, if you remember that G that was in there, that was the government spending. Back in chapter 12, we just kept it constant, right? We didn't really worry about it too much. But what happens if we actually increase the governmental spending? We increase that G. Well, then that's going to actually move up that or shift out that aggregate demand. It's going to shift it to the right. So we're going to see a change based off of that formula back from chapter 12. But let's just think about it conceptually. How does this actually work? So if we increase government spending, it means the government's buying more, right? So if the government's buying more, then that means we need more people to produce more. If more people are producing more, then they're getting paid more, or we have more people working. So we have more income being generated within the United States on a household basis. More income means they have more money to spend. More money to spend means that they can buy more goods. More goods being bought means that we are actually having to produce more. And the cycle goes on and on. But as we begin to buy more, as people are able to buy more, the overall demand on an individual basis begins to go up, and the demand for the entire nation goes up, and it shifts to the right. So how can increased government spending actually shift aggregate demand to the right? People are buying more. They're demanding more. They have more money in order to buy more. So the other way that we can enact an expansionary fiscal policy is by cutting taxes. So how does cutting taxes impose an expansionary fiscal policy? Well, it actually increases the disposable income. If you remember, that disposable income is your income minus your taxes. And your disposable income is the amount that you can actually go and buy stuff with, spend on things. You can go and buy these things. So we're going to be actually increasing our total disposable income. If we have more money to go out and buy goods and services, again, we're shifting the aggregate demand curve to the right. If we have more money that we can go out and buy things, we demand more. We're going to be willing to pay more, and the aggregate demand is going to be going up. So this is how we can impose an expansionary fiscal policy. Now, a very good example, real-life example of this was actually during the 1930s with the New Deal set forth by FDR. So if you remember the 1930s, we were right in the middle of the Great Depression. With the Great Depression, there wasn't very many people working. So the New Deal was set in place where the government was actually paying to improve roads and improve infrastructure and do a lot of infrastructure projects. So the government was paying workers to build all these roads, to build this infrastructure up. And as these people got back to work by the government spending more, Whenever they started going back to work, then they were able to buy things that they hadn't been able to buy in a while. And as they started buying things, then all of a sudden these businesses that hadn't been able to sell anything for years, they're starting to come back into play. And they're needing to hire workers, and it spurs on the economy. It expands the economy. And it's actually combating a recessionary gap. Now, what about a contractionary fiscal policy? How does a contractionary fiscal policy work? Well, it's the exact opposite of an expansionary. In a contractionary, we're going to actually be decreasing government spending and raising taxes. So if we're decreasing government spending, we are actually going to be reducing that G from that formula way back in chapter 12, and it's going to shift the aggregate demand curve to the left. Again, let's think about it conceptually. If the government's not spending as much, and the government, let's face it, they're a major player in buying goods and services within the United States. They account for 18 to 20% of the nation's GDP. So they're buying a lot of things. Well, what if they all of a sudden don't buy as much? Well, then the companies that were relying on the government to buy their products, now all of a sudden they're not producing as much. They can't sell it. They're not going to produce as much, which means that they're going to be laying off workers. As they're laying off workers, then these workers don't make as much. If workers don't make as much, the total amount of spending goes down. The aggregate demand is actually going to shift to the left. Well, what about raising taxes? How does that impact or cause a contractionary fiscal policy? Raising taxes, it's going to actually decrease the amount of disposable income. Decreasing the amount of disposable income means people don't have as much money to spend. They're not buying as much stuff. The aggregate demand curve actually will shift to the left. Well, let's dive into a little bit more, and actually on the next video we're going to be showing some slides of how can we actually use expansionary fiscal policy to combat these recessionary gaps. How are we using that? How are we going to be able to use that and actually work? So in the next video we're going to actually go through some graphs showing that, but let's kind of go through the logistics behind it. First off, expansionary fiscal policy, it's used to combat recessionary gaps. We're trying to move the economy, spur on the economy to get us back to full employment. So expansionary fiscal policy can actually stimulate the aggregate demand. We called it shifting it to the right up here. So what we're doing is we're stimulating the aggregate demand. We're causing it to shift to the right. We're causing it to increase. And it promotes the employment of workers. As aggregate demand goes up, people are buying more things. As people are buying more things, we're needing to produce more. As we're producing more, then more people are needing to be employed. So it actually promotes the employment of workers. So expansionary fiscal policy. Expansionary fiscal policy is done by, like we were talking about previously, by reducing income taxes. In reducing the income taxes, it actually increases the disposable income of consumers and also allows retained earnings of businesses. So we don't really talk a lot about the retained earnings of businesses, but that's a major factor as well. Because if the businesses aren't being taxed as much, they don't have to pay as much in expenses. So they get to keep more profit. If they have more profit, they can retain more of that and be able to use that retained earnings as money for more investments and actually use those investments to produce even more. So reducing the income taxes is going to increase the disposable income of households, allowing households to buy more, and actually increases the retained earnings of businesses, allowing businesses to buy more. So these two, meaning the households, meaning the consumers, the households, and the businesses, these two components constitute 80% of U.S. GDP. So if we can allow the businesses and the households, businesses and the consumers to be buying more, it's going to shift that aggregate demand out. And those two make up 80% of U.S. GDP. The other aspect, like we've been talking about, is increasing government spending. If we're increasing government spending, if the government's able to buy more, then that means that we're selling more goods, a lot of times more American-made goods, meaning that we're going to be needing to employ more workers and actually spur on the economy that way. Now, like I've been saying, the government is no slouch when it comes to actually purchases, because the government actually accounts for 20% of U.S. GDP. So basically what the expansionary fiscal policy is doing is it's meant to put more money or to increase spending from the consumers by lowering taxes, increase spending from businesses by more retained earnings, lowering taxes and more retained earnings. Households, they'll have more disposable income, and increase government spending overall to just, in any case, expansionary fiscal policy is trying to encourage more spending within the nation to shift the aggregate demand curve to the right.